So we've structured this as kind of 5 lesser known facts and 5 opportunities that each of us have, and if I'm using my math correctly, that gets a total of 10. So we'll try to work through that, and I'll get started. But I was really pleased to hear you give a historical perspective, because I'm going to offer an historical perspective for point number 1, and that's growth in the number and complexity of ESG issues. Now, I'm going to go all the way back to December 7th of 1941. That moment changed agricultural history, changed obviously U.S. and world history, and it changed the trajectory of U.S. agriculture. Because after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States decided to join the Allies and participate in World War II as a full participant, no longer just supplying munitions and food, etc. And at that moment, food security and national security became synonymous. And the signal went out to agriculture to grow as much as you can, to produce as much as you can, at the expense of nearly every other attribute. So for the last 80 years, we've been focused on increasing productivity and throughput as a primary metric of success. And so when you talk to corn growers, you talk to cotton growers, you talk to soybean growers, pork producers, cattle producers, dairy producers, et cetera, they're always talking about we are producing more product using fewer resources, but the focus is on increasing productivity. And that was really essential at that point in time, and it created the culture of agriculture for the last 80 years, is the focus on output. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a shift in that. Initially, it began with a discussion around corporate social responsibility, or CSR, and then we integrated the concept of sustainability, which was broadly defined as being green, and Jason may have a more well-defined definition of sustainability. But all of that was kind of viewed as an external affairs function. We've now seen a transition, led not in small part by the financial markets, the capital markets, to what we're calling, what is now referred to as ESG. And those initials stand for environment, social, and governance. And you're able to put a number of different socially relevant topics or issues under each of those headings: environment, social, and governance. Jason has phenomenal expertise in all of those. We'll talk about those, and we'll talk about some of these in a little more detail. What's fundamentally different about the introduction of ESG is this is no longer just an external affairs function. It's being integrated into business functions, and because the capital markets are paying attention and they're measuring performance. So we have the Financial Accounting Standards Board, or FASB, which sets the rules for accounting. We now have SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is going to set some structure for how we measure and report sustainability progress. We manage what we measure. And so the measurement of these activities, the measurement of our ability to perform and the outputs, will now be integrated into the financial reports of leading organizations, which means it's going to become more a part of the culture of agriculture and food as we continue to go forward. And we'll talk more about that as we continue to have conversation. But that really picked up steam over the last 2 years during the pandemic for a wide range of reasons. Obviously, the increased climate change that we've seen, the racial tension that we've seen that hasn't really reached a peak that we've seen recently since 1968, and the variety of other issues that are now coming to bear. And this list is not exhaustive. We did some secondary research and identified more than 250 different topics that somebody in the food system is working to address under the headline of ESG. So there will be additional challenges around the impact of food and food production on people, animals, and the planet today and over time. So we need to anticipate that and prepare for that, because it's not going to be just a sole focus on productivity and throughput any longer. It's going to be a focus on what is the actual impact to others? What is the actual impact on society? And a growing number of consumers and other stakeholders, including the financial markets, are willing to say, we respect and appreciate your focus on productivity, but we want other attributes to now have the same level of focus and the same level of priority. And so we need to not look at this as an either or, but both and, as we continue to go forward, because the pressure to address these other issues is simply going to continue to increase. And what's fundamentally different now is that your performance on those issues is now going to be measured and reported in the financial markets. So what's the opportunity that goes with that? First, embrace this shift in social expectations. For too long, there are those in agriculture who have embraced the party of no. Right? We can't do this, we're not going to do it, we don't want to do it, we're going to pretend it didn't happen, whatever the case may be. You can adopt that posture, but if you do so, then your only opportunity is compliance once it's become mandated, and then it's simply a commodity and a cost of doing business. There's no opportunity to extract additional value or become a preferred supplier if your first position is no, rather than saying, how can I become a preferred supplier or extract a premium by being an early adopter in some of these activities and being an early adopter in addressing some of these challenges. The other one, and this is where really we need all of agriculture to come together, is we really need to work collectively to assure equitable distribution of the cost and value associated with ESG demands. Jason can speak to this much more eloquently and in more in depth than I can, but there is cost and there is value. Restaurants and retailers have determined that more than 90% of their emissions come from their supply chain. So they can continue to put pressure on the supply chain all the way back to the point of production to reduce environmental impact and to reduce emissions. There will be costs associated with that. So how do we assure that farmers are sustainable as well economically? How do we assure that there is equitable distribution of the cost and value of ESG? There are some companies willing to do that, but we need to raise that conversation to a higher profile, not in a confrontational way, but in a way that embraces the evolution of ESG, but also then says we need to make sure if we're going to have resilient and reliable supply chain that goes all the way back to the point of production, that primary producers or farmers have the economic support they need to be able to implement these practices as we continue to go forward. So that's number one for me, kind of the evolution and the expanse in the growth in number and complexity of ESG opportunities and issues, and the opportunity that we go from here and embrace that and look for that opportunity to capture value.
So for me, the number one is that the world is changing faster than our response. In the short term, if you think about it, we've understood that climate change has been coming for 40 years. And our responses, at best, I would say, have been piecemeal. We haven't seen anything that approaches a multinational approach to really addressing this issue, as if our lives depend on it, because they actually do. Some of the latest studies about modeling of climate impacts is that if we stopped emissions today, the impacts from climate change would still be felt in 2500. That's approximately 21 generations. Most Native American groups that have been the most far forward thinking that I'm aware of are thinking in terms of 7 generations. Nobody's thinking in terms of 21. How do we deal with 21 generation changes? I think we need to start identifying pathways and lay the groundwork and assume that others will build on them later. But we need to get started sooner rather than later. There's been a connection between food and culture and food and civilization. It's no accident that it's called agriculture. It's very much part of who we are, what we eat, etc. I think that looked at another way, the landscape is strewn with civilizations that failed because they expanded beyond their ability to produce food for their populations. How many of you have ever heard of the term Earth Overshoot Day? Okay, so that's the day when scientists have calculated that we have used the equivalents in resources that all the renewable natural resources on the planet in their present state would produce in a year. This year, when that calculation was first made in 1970, it was about 1 year of use to 1 year. So it was on December 31st, you'd achieved your Earth Overshoot Day, which was maybe half a day. Today, Earth Overshoot Day is July 28th. So anything after that is like with a bank account, we're living on the principal, not the interest. And I think that's probably the best way to think about it. So how do we take some of these big problems and start to pick away at them? How do we think about changing them? There is no question that where and how we produce food has had more impact on the planet than any other single human activity. So it is both a driver of climate change, but also being affected by climate change. So we need to be working on food in 2 different ways in this regard. in any process like this, there's a period of awareness, then there's a period of kind of, I don't know, agreement, if you will, and then more consensus, and then the development of a strategy, and perhaps piloting or documenting what people have done around that strategy, and then you go to scale. So 30 to 40 years into a discussion of climate change, do you think we're at agreement yet? Do you think we're at consensus yet? We're certainly not at a strategy yet, and I don't think we've got scale on our mind yet. This is not unusual. I work in the environmental field, and I've been working on issues like deforestation and overfishing for many, many years. And there's still issues with deforestation and overfishing. We haven't solved those problems yet. We keep kicking the can down the road trying to get a good enough solution, but it's not a good solution. But I think now we're being confronted by even different issues. Let me just put a couple on the table. A lot of people know what post-harvest loss is, certainly farmers, traders, et cetera. And people, because of their own purchases, know what waste is, food waste, because of shrinkage in the grocery store, in your refrigerator, after a meal, takeout, et cetera. But there is a new category now that I don't think anybody's talking about, and that I would call climate loss. It's the food that is wasted because planting's delayed, because you have to plant an inferior crop because you couldn't get it in soon enough, or the crop that you plant doesn't make it to maturity, or there's a violent storm that destroys it, or hail, or wind. Choose your weapon, as it were. Right now, the estimates are that climate loss may be as much as 10% of global food production. So when have you read about that in a newspaper? When have you seen a strategy to look at, well, if we're producing 10% less food, we must be doing something to either produce more or waste less, or how are we addressing that issue? Nada. There's another piece of work that I think is really important here, and that is that the studies now show that climate change will affect net primary productivity. So it's not just what we use. Climate itself is going to reduce the productivity of soils, of fisheries, of algae in oceans, of forests, of grasslands by 10 to 15% within 20, 25 years. So what that means for a farmer or for a food system is that we have to tread water faster, or we have to swim faster to basically remain where we are. And if we want to get ahead and actually produce for those 2 billion more people that are coming, or anticipated, that are going to have more income and consume even more than we do on average today, where's all that going to come from? So these are some of the questions that I think we need to be teeing up in this discussion. Next slide. So where are the opportunities? It seems to me that we're beginning to see that producers are already starting to plant different crops. I noticed on the drive over from St. Louis yesterday, I saw at least 8 to 10 fields, big fields of sorghum. That's new. And yet that's exactly a crop that is adapted to drier climates. It's deeper rooted. It has great foliage. It has a lot of organic matter. It can build soils, especially if you can figure out a way to do no-till around it. It's just got so much biomass that is going to be a little bit of an issue. But can we take the anti-nutritionals out of it so you can actually use it for poultry and pork feed instead of corn or instead of soybeans so much, or at least in substitution for part of it? So I think these are some of the ways that we need to begin to think about new crops. But now this is happening at individual farmers level. How are farmers learning from each other? Where are the platforms for them to actually learn from each other? If one farmer is learning something, that's one learning curve. We can't afford to have 10,000 learning curves just in Missouri alone, and maybe 1 billion learning curves around the planet. But we also can't afford to have 50 learning curves in land-grant universities. We can't have 200 learning curves in governments. We can't have 10,000 learning curves with companies. We've got to find ways for people to share information more quickly so that we can all learn more quickly. Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together. Producing more food more sustainably is something that we all depend on doing. So what are companies beginning to do about that? I think that is where we're seeing action sooner than elsewhere. We're seeing more long-term contracts where they are beginning to contract with farmers, not on the price, but on the volumes, and on 5 years or 10 years, so that those same farmers can use the contract as an asset to borrow against and invest in more resilient production over the long term. We're seeing what we call whole crop purchases, where the downstream buyer will agree to buy not just what they contracted, but they'll buy the entire crop. Because if a farmer produces enough extra to make sure they've met the contract, all that food's going to be wasted otherwise. So even if you pay a lesser price for it, getting it off the farm and getting it into the food system is something that's very important that we need to start looking at now. But I think the key to all of this really is going to be learning how to share information. That people see this as a way to learn faster, not as a competitive advantage. Sustainability is not about a mark on a product. It's odd, for example, today, that if a product is sustainable, you expect to pay more for it. Why shouldn't you actually be paying more for the product that isn't sustainable? It's costing the earth. There's a lot of complaints about subsidies and government programs, and maybe we're spending too much or we're spending it on the wrong system. We're reinforcing the system that we've got rather than the one we need. And all that's, I think, good for discussion. But by the same token, what the governments put into food systems globally, take your pick, somewhere between $500 and $700 billion, the planet puts in 10 times that much. The planet is subsidizing food production. You see it whenever you see mud in a stream. You see it in a ditch. You see it in a deforested area. You see it in a grassland that you can see the earth between the stalks of grass, etc. So anyway, we've got a lot of opportunities, but we're not organizing around them, and we're not working together to solve them fast enough.
Okay, number 2 for me, the evolution of alternatives to animal protein. So this was coming on hard and fast at the beginning of the pandemic, and consumers were looking for products that would help boost their immune system. And there's continuing to be a growing number of consumers that are looking for the better for me, better for the planet options. That's one of the key takeaways from all of the alt meat and alt dairy work that's been done or is being done, all the product development that's being done. There is real interest in better for me, better for the planet. And so all of us need to internalize that and begin to appreciate what can we do to produce products that are perceived to be better for me and better for the planet. And not just perceived that way, but actually are better for me, better for the planet. Because the initial sampling, the initial trial of this, whether it's the Impossible Burger, Beyond Meat, whatever it happened to be, was through the roof. And then consumers stopped buying it because the product didn't compete on taste and price. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that and what happens in the next iteration, because the market for this aren't true believers. The market for these products aren't vegetarians or vegans. There aren't enough to justify the capital. I was talking to a friend in the venture capital community a couple of weeks ago, and he said there are 80 products currently competing for a shrinking shelf space in the alt meat category. About maybe 10, maybe 20% of them will survive, but the capital that has been poured into those is a reflection of the desire to support better for me, better for the planet products. It's also to support a new category at retail. Rarely is there a new category that's actually introduced into the supermarket. So the opportunity to become dominant in a new category generated a lot of interest from investors as well. So the demand for better for me, better for the planet is real, and it's growing. And we need to internalize that. I think there are some in agriculture who have looked at kind of the downfall of the current alt meat category and said, Well, we told you so. This was just a fad. It's not going to survive. Maybe, but we'll talk about where it's going to evolve from here from my perspective. But the lessons that we can take away from this, one of them is that the interest in better for me, better for the planet products is real and growing. As I said before, the current alternatives, the current iterations, do not compete on taste or price. And at the end of the day, if you can't compete specifically on taste, you can't compete. Because there's only a certain number of consumers that are going to be true believers that are going to buy a product if it doesn't meet the taste profile or the price point that they're accustomed to or that they're willing to pay. So you've seen a lot of activity in this space commercially, but the only place where you're beginning to see it really have an impact is in the dairy case. So what's different about the dairy case? It could be that close enough is good enough in some areas, right? So the dairy alternatives are white, they're emulsified, they're sold in the dairy case, they're sold in similar packaging, and if I'm using it on cereal or to flavor my coffee or for some other purpose, and I'm not drinking it as a glass of milk, or perhaps even if I am, it's close enough. And so we've seen greater penetration in fluid dairy alternatives than we have in any other sector, which is really interesting. And that sector has exploded as well. Virtually every nut or grain on the planet has been converted to some kind of dairy alternative. You can buy spelt milk on Amazon if you're interested. Honest to God, you can go online and buy spelt milk if you'd like to buy some. So it's really interesting that you can look at this and say, okay, where are we going? The target market for all of these are flexitarians, people who really want to do something that's better for them and better for the planet. But the products today simply don't meet that demand, particularly when you get to price and taste. So where do we go from here? Because the competition is far from over. This competition is a long way from being done. So the opportunity, as I see it, is to really lean into that desire for better for me, better for the planet alternatives, and talk about how you are making progress on that. So for example, if you are a meat, dairy, or beef or chicken producer, poultry producer, generally, the products you sell have a single ingredient, which is attractive to many. You've got micronutrients and macronutrients that oftentimes can't be found in other products. You continue to work on improving your environmental footprint, which is going to become a requirement as we continue to go forward. So lean into this and talk about what you're doing to meet that desire for better for me, better for the planet products, as to simply resisting them. The other thing is to really understand and appreciate that the current consolidation and integration that we're seeing or rationalization that we're seeing in this market will mean that the survivors will be stronger and they will be significantly better. So in 5 years from now, the 10% that survive will be able to compete on price and taste. And at that point, it's an entirely new game. So don't assume that this competition is over. It's not. I kind of look at this in a similar way to the dot-com bubble that happened back in 2005. There was all of the irrational exuberance, and if you had a website, you could attract capital and people would invest in you, and boom, it burst. We're seeing the same thing happen now with meat alternatives. So that capital is likely to be washed out. The survivors will retrench. They will improve their formulations. They will amalgamate science and technology from others. And in the next 5 to 7 years, versions 2, 3, 4, and 5 will be markedly better than what's in the market today. And it will be much more competitive. And once it reaches parity on price and taste, then it's game on, because that's what it has to achieve in order to be competitive long term.
So I'm beginning to feel a little bit like the wet blanket here. Because I think there are a lot of problems, there are some opportunities. But I think if we don't understand the conditions that we're facing squarely and try to address them, then we're being very foolish. So let me continue on this rant, if you will, a little bit. So what we're seeing now is that crops and animals and pathogens are all moving toward the poles and away from the equator. And that's true of fish as well. As oceans get warmer, the fish schools are moving. This is disrupting food everywhere. And we're already have about 140 million people displaced from climate change, with the expectation it will be 1 to 1.5 billion between 2040 and 2050. That's 1 in every 8 people. Imagine 1 in every 8 of you in the audience being displaced to a new home. The U.S. is not going to be impervious to this kind of change. It's going to be happening here too. So where are we seeing this already? We're seeing the permafrost melt in Siberia. We're seeing people start to farm it. Now, this is a double-edged sword. The permafrost is probably an incredible area of organic matter. It's still, much of the grass that has been frozen is still green. Many of the pathogens that are in that grass are still viable 10,000 years later. Anthrax was just plowed up in Russia, and a child in a local community died from it this last year. We're seeing the Chinese move in and contract farm this with Russians. Now, so what the scientists have said now in retrospect is, yes, we kind of missed the permafrost. We thought it was going to bind with iron and it was going to not volatilize into the atmosphere. But now with that source of CO2, the melting of the permafrost will produce as much greenhouse gas emissions as all humans do. That little miscalculation. It does lead one to wonder sometimes about the science of all this. And I think making do with better science is what we're confronted with. We're never going to have perfect science. We seem to have muddled through the coronavirus pretty well with imperfect science. I think we've just got to get the move on and do the same thing with climate change. We've got to, as they say, build the plane as we fly it. Now, the only thing worse than the melting of the permafrost is when you farm it, because that causes the CO2 and the methane and the nitrous oxide to volatilize even faster. And that is what's happening now. The first crops of soy and wheat and corn have been harvested from what was permafrost 10 years ago. Canada is also moving into massive pulse and soy production in areas that could never be plowed in the past. So we're losing prairie grass in both the upper western Midwest in the grasslands, but also into Canada. Canada is exporting 2 million tons of pulses to India every year. Russia seems to be intent on exporting to China. The northern Great Plains is now producing wheat and soy and corn from areas that couldn't have been farmed in the past, had never been plowed, in fact, because they weren't viable, and now they are. What we're seeing in the U.S. is the movement north of crops like soy and wheat and corn and cotton about 20 to 30 miles a year. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it kind of adds up to 200 to 300 miles a decade to, 500 miles or 1,000 miles in half a century. These are not insignificant distances. I remember giving a talk in Chicago. I don't think it was the one you attended, but where I showed a map that suggested that cotton would reach I-70 by 2040. And afterwards, a person from Kansas came up to me and said, we're growing cotton north of I-70 already in Kansas. And so when I was driving across the middle of Missouri, I was looking to see if there's cotton already, because there will be soon. In fact, Illinois, southern Illinois, will be one of the big cotton producing areas by 2050, 2060, and by 2070, Des Moines is expected to be. And then it moves north into Minnesota. This is how crops are moving. Farmers probably are not going to be moving that fast. And so what are they going to be growing, and how can they adapt? That, in fact, is your job. And so you're going to be needing not to know all these things, but to help set up the systems where farmers can learn from each other and learn from other farmers and learn from universities that may not be in Missouri, because there are extension groups in Texas that handle cotton better than the University of Missouri does. It's just a given at this point in time. So I've mentioned plants, but animals are going to be moving north as well. It's too hot for mammals. When you have a certain number of days over 90 or over 100 every summer, that's very hot for mammals. They're going to be, even poultry, but they're going to be moving north, and they're going to follow the feed. And so those industries are going to move north. The question is, what is going to be in a place like Missouri? Next slide. So I think what we're going to find is that marginal areas are going to become better. We're going to find that there are longer growing seasons for certain crops, and they can move into other areas where they couldn't be grown in the past. That explains cotton. But I was just with a Vermont dairy farmer who said that before the last couple of years, they couldn't grow 90-day corn because they didn't have a long enough growing season. Now they can grow 105-day corn. And that's kind of how fast things are changing for farmers. There's also going to be new foods and new feed ingredients that farmers are going to have access to. I mentioned sorghum. Algae is going to be another one, grown in water rather than on land. We're just now exploring with the world's largest pet company the capture and use of carp out of the Mississippi River system to use for pet food as a way to hold in check an invasive species. There's going to be a lot more invasive species with climate change because animals are going to be migrating as well. But I think the big opportunity that all this points to is focus on gene editing and CRISPR, and looking at not just plants and animals, but also at gut organisms, at soil organisms, at pathogens, at weeds. There's many ways to skin a cat, as they say. So if we can go after the weed instead of the row crop, or if we can go after the pathogen instead of the domesticated animal or plant, then we can do the same amount. And I think that type of work is starting to happen now. But the biggest gains, I think, in the next 20 years are going to be on soil health and what we know about soil and soil organisms.
Great, thank you, Jason. Okay, reinventing the supply chain. Marshall mentioned some of the trials that he had going to the grocery store and finding things out of stock. I doubt there's anybody either here in person or watching online that didn't experience the same during COVID. Out of stocks were endemic across the entire food system. So we're beginning to think about, as I talk to food companies, what we're hearing more is how can we design our systems to be just in case, not just in time. And so they're looking for ways to become more resilient, and there are lots of opportunities. One of them is ingredient flexibility. There are 21 ingredients in a Totino's pizza roll, right? And General Mills knew that the Totino's pizza roll, a lot of heat and serve products were incredibly popular during the pandemic because I can pick them up in the freezer, I can put them in the oven, I can get them on the table, there's some comfort food, this all works really well. So there was tremendous demand for Totino's pizza rolls, but guess what? They couldn't find all of those 21 ingredients on a consistent basis. So they put together a special group that really focused, and it included procurement, food scientists, label and regulatory, people in their kitchens, et cetera, that took this on collectively to say, what can we do to become more resilient and more flexible in our ingredients? They now developed 25 approved recipes to create Totino's pizza rolls. So it's great for General Mills, but it also provides other opportunities. What if some of those other ingredients have less impact on the environment? What if some of those other ingredients have higher nutritional value? What if some of those other ingredients allow them to engage with disadvantaged farmers or farmers that they haven't been able to on a regular basis because of scale issues? So it gives us the opportunity, once you create flexibility in the system, to look for new ideas, right? Disruption is the catalyst for creating change and for challenging the status quo. And so I have no reason to believe that the food scientists at General Mills would have looked for an additional recipe if there hadn't been sufficient disruption to force them to challenge the status quo to go, what are we going to do now? And companies are looking to find ways to create more resiliency in their supply chain, which now gives us the opportunity in agriculture to begin to ask the question, what can we do to help our food partners become more resilient? The second thing we're really seeing is SKU rationalization. So the SKU is just the barcode that identifies an individual product. And you may have noticed when we saw things that were out of stock, when they began to come back into stock, not everything came back in at the same time or the same pace, and some products have never come back in and will never come back in. So when you talk to people at Coca-Cola and Mondelez and other organizations, what they did was to say, okay, if we can't get all the aluminum we need for cans, or we can't get this ingredient, or we can't get that ingredient, let's focus on those products that we're are core to our business and where we generate the most margin. What they discovered was their business was actually healthier and they generated more profits by reducing the number of SKUs. So if you are in love with diet vanilla caffeine-free Coca-Cola, I'm sorry, it's gone and it's not coming back, right? So if you've gone down the soda aisle, it's one of the aisles where you can really appreciate this, where there are many fewer facings, but those facings are much deeper, because they've gone back to kind of the core offerings that they've delivered. Now, I have no doubt that in the next generation or so, someone in marketing at those companies will go, hey, what if we expand this line again? And that conversation will take place. But one of the ways that companies dealt with the limited ability to secure all of the products they needed was to rationalize the number of SKUs, limit the number of products they were producing, and they actually found that that made them more profitable in many cases. So they're not changing that behavior. So a lot of the things that went away are not coming back because they've now decided this is the more effective way for them to run their business. The other thing we're seeing, and I think this is just the tip of the iceberg, is backward integration and portfolio diversification. For those of you that are Costco shoppers, I am one. You know, the $4.99 rotisserie chicken is a staple, and every time I go in to buy one, I spend $250. So it's a great model for Costco, right? It works really well for them, but they've got to continue to find that chicken that they can sell for $4.99. So Costco built their own chicken operations, right? They've got their own chicken plant, one of the most modern in the country, maybe in the world. It's a phenomenal facility. If you haven't had a chance to see it, or go online and look at some of the YouTube. Significantly reduced water usage, significantly reduced labor requirements, so they can continue to offer that chicken. They contract grow with growers in the area, so they've backward integrated into poultry production to allow them to have the security of that supply chain. Walmart's done some of the same with dairy in Michigan, and they most recently made a significant investment in a packing plant for sustainable beef, which will, I think, is the name of the company, which is putting together the processing plant in Nebraska. So we're going to see more and more backward integration as well, as companies look for ways to plan for just in case as opposed to just in time, realizing that the supply chain is more fragile and less resilient than perhaps we thought it might have been prior to the pandemic. So there are lessons to be learned from this as well. So what's the opportunity? One, become indispensable. The way you become indispensable is by helping your customer be more resilient. It's not by looking for the best possible price today on a commodity product, but how can I add value by making my customer more resilient? The other opportunity is to go to companies like General Mills and say, now that you have these 25 different recipes, help me understand all of the ingredients that are in them, and is there an opportunity for me to partner with you to help provide that resiliency that you're looking for? So rather than simply looking at what can I do to maximize my price on a commodity product, what can I do to add value by increasing the resiliency of the supply chain? Because historically, that's not been a place where we've thought about adding value, but it is a place we need to add value today. And then explore new partnership opportunities and new channels. Direct-to-consumer continues to become extremely popular. It's growing exponentially as a result of what we've seen during the pandemic, and the barriers to entry have been reduced dramatically. So lots of different ways to think about how we can take what's happening in the supply chain and the disruption and capture opportunity from that.
So now I'm going to digress for the first time and go back to something that Charlie mentioned about the Costco plant. Basically, one of the problems they were trying to solve for was that by ordering chickens to be produced in so many different places around the country, they had a very hard time getting the exact same size, same taste, same flavor profile chicken every time. And it was simpler to try to do that themselves. But I think in addition to all the things that he said about that, they actually worked with outgrowers for the eggs and for the chicks, as well as for the chickens that were raised. They had long-term contracts with soy and corn producers in the region to provide the feed that they would need. We went so far as to try to get them to organize these groups as some type of legal status with the company, socios or other actors, so that they could actually gain access to Costco's healthcare system. because that's one of the things rural areas need more than anything else is good health care at affordable prices. And if being a part of the Costco value chain would allow you to access that, I think it could have been a really good thing. They couldn't make it happen, but those are the kinds of things that are going to start happening. Because I think right now, it's clear that global supply chains and even local supply chains like that one are probably some of the most inequitable institutions on the planet from a DEI point of view, from a diversity, equity, inclusion. And companies are seeing that, and they're realizing that. And they will start finding ways to make it work going forward. In a very similar type of situation, but in a global supply chain as opposed to a domestic one, Mars has entered into 15-year contracts on cocoa that give premiums for producers who plant cocoa on degraded land rather than clearing forest. They give they have a base price, which is the average low price for the previous 10 years. It will never go below the average of those 10-year prices. And then there are 3 rewards or premiums producers get for performing key environmental impact reduction, and 3 for key social impact reduction. In short, producers can make 3 times the price for cocoa by working with Mars on this system, because Mars is setting up a system of suppliers forever, for the future. People make enough money and have access to a long-term contract that lets them borrow money, plant trees that have 4 years before they produce and still have enough income to live on and take care of their families. This is a new thing in the cocoa world. This is why there's been so much child labor in cocoa. If a farmer makes 56 cents a day or 80 cents a day in Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana, what are they going to pay labor? Well, turns out not very much. And that's why you get things like child labor. So these contracts are intended to really address those issues. So, issue 3, what are farmers going to produce? And what are their markets going to be as a result of climate change? And I think here we have to realize that a lot of farmers are going to stay in place. They're not going to migrate with the crops they knew how to produce. So they will continue to grow some of those crops in areas that are best suited for them, but they will also try new crops. They'll probably grow more crops in total and smaller amounts of them. This will have implications for their equipment needs, for their labor needs, for all kinds of things. So we're probably going to see farmers working together more than they have in the past, because they can't all afford separately to invest in each of these new types of equipment. In fact, growing up on a farm in the 50s and 60s, this is what farmers did in the old days. They shared equipment because nobody could afford to buy it outright. It was only when it was fence post to fence post and it was 2 crops that you could suddenly start affording to buy the kinds of equipment that you used. So we're going to see more and more of that type of thing happening going forward. What are the opportunities? In Brazil in I don't know, 1970, 1980, sugar growers grew sugar. By 1980 and 1990, they grew sugar and ethanol. By 2000, they produced sugar, ethanol, and electricity by burning the gas. They were full energy plants producing equal amounts and equal revenue streams from each of those 3 things. So those are the kinds of things that I think we're going to see more and more of. U.S. dairy right now. If they were just selling dairy, they would be having a hard time. And we've gone from 60,000 dairy producers to about 35 plus right now in the last decade. So dairy has been hard hit. What can they do? Well, we're beginning to see them cross over with beef cattle so that they're producing USDA prime beef as well. We're beginning to see biogas digesters where they're producing energy, also renewable natural gas. Now they're beginning to also sell NP and K from the substrate, liquid ammonia from the substrate. Yara has long-term contracts that allow them to borrow the money to put in these kinds of more sophisticated biogas digesters. This is what's happening in the dairy world. So we've been interested in what are the next types of food production that we need to understand as an environmental organization that we can experiment with. And one of the things that we did was, after I gave a talk at the Danforth Center, we began to work with people in St. Louis, a couple dozen different organizations in the mayor's office, with Bayer, with Danforth, with Missouri Botanical Gardens, et cetera, to look at what a vertical ag operation in the city of St. Louis would look like using stranded assets. So brownfields using heat and water from a thermal power plant that's going to go out of existence in the future but hasn't yet, so there's still this availability. There's cheap land. There's also stranded assets in the form of people in St. Louis that are unemployed that can be brought to bear. That project has just now went through a period of bidding, and I think a dozen people tried to get the contract to do that development. One ended up getting it, and they will break ground in December or January. It'll be a 5-acre vertical farm, 60 feet tall, probably the biggest in the US and maybe one of the biggest in the world. St. Louis has agreed to create a center of excellence for vertical ag so that they can test different genetics, different types of worker models, and also automation for harvesting, different energy systems, different heat loss systems, different safety protocols. Nobody's really had a major safety issue yet with these vertical ag situations, but it's only a question of time before that happens. So we need a center of excellence. There are about 150 operations in the US. This, we think, will probably be the center of excellence in the US, but also maybe globally for some time to come. We're also looking at, anybody who's looking at the newspaper realizes that it's not just the price of tomatoes that are going to go up, and tomato sauce and tomato juice and pizzas and everything in the year because of the lack of production of tomatoes in California. It's that most vegetables are going to decline in California. So our question was, where's the next California? And as we looked around, we began to see where has the same amount of land, what area has the same amount of water or more, abundant labor that's probably lower priced, lower land prices. And we came to the conclusion that the mid-delta in the Mississippi, where the Arkansas River comes together, including the Boot Hill of Missouri, you could begin to think about at least parts of the California agriculture system moving there. But instead of building it piecemeal and an add-on over a 100-year period, you could start with a totally different structure where you could actually have staggered plantings so that you could have permanent labor systems that were employed full-time with benefits and retirement plans. You could also have worker equity or profit sharing set up into the system so that producers are getting some of the value that's downstream. You could also have communities selling bonds to finance this type of production system rather than just financing local schools. This would be an income source for a community over the long term that would keep younger people and that would provide income in towns. But I think the bigger issue probably from the farmers' point of view that are staying around after crops begin to move that they've been used to is to start growing environmental services that they sell in conjunction with their products. So we're beginning to see farmers sell carbon or sell greenhouse gas emissions reductions with the commodity crops that they're selling. We're also beginning to see farmers who, and virtually every farmer can tell you which part of their land is less productive. We're seeing them look at that land now with a different eye. They can produce more carbon or they can produce higher quality water effluents off of that than they can crops. So why don't they actually link that up to the crop they're selling and sell that to downstream buyers? And that's beginning to happen. We can see them creating habitat and biodiversity. We're even seeing larger regions beginning to organize. So in fact, some dairy cooperatives that are losing members are now keeping the members that no longer produce milk and having them reduce emissions, produce carbon sequestration by planting trees and other things. There are ways that different farmers can come together and bundle products, not just across a single farm, but across a whole system. So I think we're beginning to see more moves in that area, and as the markets get better, we'll definitely see that happening. and is going to be driven by the downstream buyers, not so much by the speculators on carbon.
Okay, great. I'll move to number 4. I realize we're running out of time here, so I'm going to go a little more quickly on these last 2 to try to pick up pace a little bit. I really believe we are headed into the golden age of ag technology. This is an exciting time to be where we are in agriculture, and particularly ag technology, because there is a new felt need for what ag technology brings to society. Historically, there's been a relatively low felt need beyond the farm gate. Because supply chains were full, people were getting what they needed to formulate what they wanted to produce, and so there just wasn't a perception that we need additional solutions from ag technology, but the world has changed over the last couple of years. We had COVID-19, and not only are people now seeing all the disruption, but we're having public conversations about messenger RNA. So we're having public conversations about the science that's making all of this possible, which gives us a phenomenal opportunity then to be able to introduce some of this. I'm a big fan of gene editing. I agree with Jason that this is going to be one of the crucial technologies, as well as other new technologies that come into play. And we clearly saw with the Biden administration recent announcement in support of biotechnology that the administration is getting behind that to support it as well. Food inflation is now causing people to rethink, do we need different kinds of food systems? What else can we do to create more predictability in pricing? Because this is the kind of inflation, again, that drives change because people demand it. The war in Ukraine, the disruption that has caused across global supply chains continues to be a factor. And there are other changes that we've seen, whether it's extreme localized weather events or other activities, that we simply need new tools to solve some of these problems. We don't have all the tools that we need today to be able to address some of these pressing issues. So it's a great time to be in agriculture and embrace ag technology, because society is now talking about ag technology in a very different way as well. The caveat to that is that social acceptance requires investment, right? These products, these services, these technologies will not simply be accepted on their own. Science is foundational for acceptance, but it's not sufficient. Science tells us whether or not we can do something. Society tells us whether or not we should. And what we've learned from previous generations of ag technology is just because we can doesn't mean society believes we should. You can look at the GMO debate, RBST, the low acrylamide potato, and the list goes on and on and on, from technologies that may have received some market acceptance, others that did not, but were perfectly safe, and the science behind them was sound, but science alone is not sufficient to justify acceptance. There has to be a concerted effort and an integrated effort to build technology, and it's more about the why than the how or the what. People are interested in the motives and how will these benefits accrue to society. Don't just focus on productivity and output. That's the post-World War II mantra for agriculture that is no longer persuasive. You have to focus on what are the benefits that accrue to the environment, to animals, to people in very different ways, because that's the technology that will generate much greater support. And also understand that transparency is absolutely essential in building trust. We struggle with transparency as a concept in agriculture. We tell people, look, we have nothing to hide, but it's none of your business, right? That doesn't fly in today's environment, because when everybody expects to be able to access any information they want from their smartphone, we have to be engaged in this conversation. And transparency is no longer just about disclosing, it's engaging in dialogue, because people want to have the opportunity to engage and learn and be connected. And so it requires a different skill set, but most importantly, it requires a different mindset to be able to embrace transparency and the need to generate acceptance if we're going to be successful going forward.
So the way I define this is that we're at the end of commodities as we know them. Commodities based on physical properties, commodities based on weight, on humidity, on brokens, on foreign matter, on color, etc. Those were the definitions of commodities that we lived with for 150 years, but now we're looking for something different. I think it's just important to go back in history just for a moment, and I'll do this quickly. But commodities were invented right after interchangeable parts, and it's not an accident, because up to the 1840s, every bag of grain from a farm went all the way to the processing plant in that bag. It was not added to others. It was not mixed. It was kept identity secure. Once the common definitions for number 2 yellow corn or soybeans or the color of cotton and all these things happen, then you could start mixing them, and that's what gave commodity traders the efficiencies that they have built up over time. But right now, I think what we're moving to is a time where people want to know more. Next slide. So they want to know about traceability. They want to know where a product was produced. They want to know about transparency, about the how of how it was produced. The traceability is not just to a country, but also to a region or to even a specific farm, or at least a group of farms. They want to know the transparency. Was there child labor? Was there deforestation? Were there other attributes that are carried as liabilities embedded in the products you're selling me or that I'm selling to my customers? It's not a question of need to know, it's a right to know. If I'm buying this product from you, there is no black box. You got to open it up and show me what's inside it, and I need to know about it. And we've just been negotiating with some feed companies that include traders because they don't want to tell the buyers what's in their product. But with greenhouse gas emissions and embedded greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation connected to something like soy from Brazil, if any product has soy from Brazil in it that is not deforestation free, then that will be the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in that product. Period. There's nothing bigger than that because of all the carbon that's from the deforestation. So this is becoming much, much more of an issue, and I think we have to figure out how to move this forward. Just to put it in another perspective, which may bring it home a little faster, one of the world's largest trader buys soy in Brazil. They claim that 96% of the soy that they buy is deforestation free, and they can trace it back to the farm and the polygon where it was produced. But 4% isn't. And maybe 1% of that 4%, they probably kind of know where it's from, but they can't prove it. They take that 4% and deliberately mix it with the 96%, adding all of that carbon to all the soy that they're selling. That company makes $18 million just on the 3% margin on that 4% of soy. But what they pass on to their buyers is $44 million worth of carbon at $10 a ton. That's the liability that the buyer is going to have to pay for. And that's why people have a right to know. And that's why downstream buyers are getting fed up with traders not providing this information, or with feed companies who are often very similar to traders. They don't want to give the information either.
Okay, excellent. So my last one, as we get close to lunch, is probably appropriate. Food as medicine. This is really interesting. In the U.S., we spend more on diet-related health care than we do on tobacco-related health care. A lot of people don't realize that, but diet and health are obviously very closely connected. We did a research project with the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and FMI, the Food Industry Association, and there's growing interest in food as medicine from a public health perspective, from a cost perspective, from a productivity perspective, and from encouraging people to embrace habits that ultimately encourage longevity and healthy lifestyles. So when we think about food as medicine, there are a couple of different ways to think about it. It's about promoting health and well-being. That's for millennials and Gen Z. Those two cohorts now account for the majority of the U.S. population, but they're really interested in how can my diet, how will my diet, how does my diet impact my health and well-being, my level of activity and other activities. There's also a growing group of boomers who are interested in how can diet help me manage chronic disease. And so on both ends of the age spectrum, you see people who are really interested in food as medicine and the role that it plays. And then improved nutrition security. This is crucially important, and we'll talk on the next slide just a moment about food safety. When we think about food safety in the food system, we generally think about the absence of pathogens that cause illness. When the public thinks about food safety, they think about it more broadly. Is this good for me? Will it be good for me long term? So it's not just the absence of pathogens that cause illness, it is this something that's going to be healthful for me? So they confound healthfulness and safety in that conversation. But those who are interested are really interested in how is this going to help me improve my lifestyle and increase my longevity. So the opportunity, we identified 4 of them in the research that we did. First of all, gut health. There's a growing awareness of microbiome and the role that the microbiome plays in overall health. And so what can I do with my diet to enhance and support my microbiome? Inflammation, intolerance, and allergies. There are a growing number of people who are impacted by those either from their diet or from disease and are looking for diets that will help them reduce inflammation and reduce the likelihood of an allergic reaction or other intolerance. Diabetes and heart disease. A growing number of people are interested in what can I do to make sure that my diet has a positive impact on my health, particularly if I have a chronic disease like diabetes or health disease. And then, as I mentioned before, foodborne illness and food security, food safety, they are all kind of intermingled. But food security also includes those who are food insecure. And how do we make sure that we provide for those who are food insecure in a way that encourages them to think about food as medicine as well, and the role that food plays in a healthy, active lifestyle?
So I think the final point, which I hope by this point is obvious, is that sustainability is a pre-competitive issue, particularly when we live on a finite planet with apparently more people coming with more income and more consumption. We've got to figure out how we can all live on this planet and do it more sustainably. And there are signs. Let me just give one example of what I think is kind of state of the art moving forward. Next slide. So I've worked with a group of salmon producers for about 20 years now, and we independently with academic researchers develop standards. And about 2010, the CEOs of 17 of these companies decided that these were good standards. They would actually help them, but that the reputation of the industry is only going to be as good as the worst performer. And so they needed to bring on the poorer performing companies and share information about how to get better. That sustainability was pre-competitive. How they sold their products, what the value was, the whole fish versus fillets versus cuts, chops, etc., smoked, that was all different. But the fact that they needed more places to grow fish, they needed to have access to markets, they needed feed, etc., all of those things they all shared, and that they needed to work together. So in a period of 8 years, 50% of them actually were able to become certified. 50% of an entire sector of all the salmon aquaculture on the market today is now verified against credible standards. And they did that by sharing their data down to the individual net pens. So the individual field where cattle are would be the equivalent. They shared all their data about treatment, about feed, about escapes, about how to deal with overcrowding and density, etc. All of that information was shared and published so that the public had access to that data. They then turned around and asked us and said, we want to do the same thing now with our feed and our feed ingredients. And so that's when we started working with the feed companies. And then most recently they've said, we want to assess our greenhouse gas emissions and figure out how to reduce them as a group so that we can all put what works, what the payback period is, what the cost is, et cetera, what doesn't work, which is also just as important. And they're now embarked on that journey. When we can move an entire sector in 8 years, then we know that we are moving at the speed of climate change. Anything short of that is not. And I fear that what we're finding is a whole lot of movement that is incremental, 5%, 10%, 20%. We need to be thinking of 2x, 3x, 10x types of solutions, transformative solutions. If we know how to get there, it's not ambitious enough. Thank you.
All right, Marshall, that's it.
All I can say is, my goodness, what a wonderful overview of so many compelling issues that I think all of us probably at some level wrestle with and think about. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take about 7 or 8 minutes here. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we're going to have some from the audience. So Rob, if you want to get ready, he'll be leading some of that on the floor, he and Mel. And then we're going to close this thing out. But one of the things that came through as you guys were talking was that a lot of this change, and that's what we're talking about, transformation, and it's truly transformational. It's not just subtle change. It's not incremental. You're talking about major leaps is being driven by corporations. Tell me what's driving them, from both your perspectives, to get involved in this. I mean, there's obviously been some resistance for years in some of these areas. I think you talked about 40 years knowing some of this stuff and didn't make a dent in it for 40 years, really. But what's causing it now? What's causing them now to get engaged in this? And I'll let you guys take it from there.
I'll offer kind of three drivers that I see. Perhaps the most compelling is going to be investor pressure, where BlackRock and others have established benchmarks that they expect for ESG performance, and it's being incorporated into your financial reports in ways that now the SEC is going to require. You've got SASB setting up standards, et cetera. So that's probably the most compelling business case that we see. Consumers, a growing number of consumers are actually aligning their purchasing behavior with their values. Historically, we've not seen that. People would be happy to sign a petition or complain about something, but when they went to the grocery store, their altruistic self was replaced with their economic self, and they bought whatever was the greatest value, right? So we didn't actually see a change in purchasing behavior. Starting to see that, some of that is generational. The third one, which is interesting, is recruiting and retaining talent. And I think that's oftentimes overlooked by companies. We worked with a company that, as they were kind of doing all of their evaluation and employee engagement work, they discovered that not having a sustainability platform and not having a sustainability strategy was a huge gap in their ability to recruit and retain. And so we helped them put together a program that would address the key issues that were relevant to their values and to their brand, that would also be relevant to the employees that they wanted to hire. So investors, the capital markets, some consumers, and the ability to attract and retain Gen Z and millennial talent. I'd say those would be the three big drivers that I see.
So for me, I think companies have, more than producers or more than countries, have had much more of an interest in managing the planet. They are multinational. They operate in many countries. They know that their supplies, their products depend on having more sustainable production in those different areas. What climate change has done is really up the ante. It's kind of like COVID in the sense that climate change's impacts are going to be variable, and they're going to be rolling the same way COVID's impacts were. And so what that means for companies is that they've almost had to double down on a lot of their supply chains. So they have to have a supply chain from Latin America, but also one from Asia. Because if Latin America has a bad growing year, they need to have product coming out of Asia. So that means they've got surplus that they've potentially contracted. So how do they get rid of that? Well, they need partners that are other companies that have the same issues that they do. And so we're seeing them begin to work together in a way that they never have before. But I think that carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, I think human rights have become a big issue now with supply chains, because companies are legally liable if they're slave labor. CEOs can go to jail. Well, in fact, if an organization like WF takes money from a company that has slave labor, my CEO could go to jail too. And so these are things that are being prosecuted in the US today. So this is something that makes them much more aware of their supply chains and wanting to know exactly where and how things are produced.
Next question, Jason, I'm going to go to you first, and I want you to tell us a little more. You've said two things today that Missourians have got to be interested in. You told us California is moving to the Delta. That's really interesting, intriguing, and that obviously we have a lot of footprint down there. And you also talked about vertical agriculture and vertical farming coming to St. Louis. You want to dig into that just a little deeper for us?
So the California moving to the Delta, it's going to be not all of California, but there is exactly the same amount of land in the Delta region that's already farmed as there is in California. There is, in California, it's 75%, especially in the Delta, it's 25%. But even the row crops in the Delta are laser sighted for irrigation. So there's a lot of really good land that could very easily be California. What's going to grow there is going to depend on what happens with the heat. But the bigger issue is probably going to be the pests. And what can we do with genetic engineering now to reduce the use of pesticides and other things that we didn't have as a tool when California got started? I mean, California is growing food on a desert by importing water. Well, we don't have that luxury. We actually have rain, sometimes more than others, but we do have rain. So I think that's where the Midwest And the mid-delta could come in to produce at least some of those things, and at least for certain markets, because we might see 3 or 4 next Californias around the U.S. The reason we raised this, though, was every country has a California, and nobody's asking this question. Where's the food going to come from when our area changes and we no longer have that producing food? We've got to anticipate these problems if we're going to have a smoother, more resilient transition from one system to the next. In terms of the next California, also, look at a map. If it gets too hot in Arkansas, just go up one junction and you got the Missouri and the Mississippi. Same exact configuration. You could produce just as much there. So it's not limited just to that, or even just that. It could be both at the same time. In St. Louis, what we're seeing is now that there's going to be about, it looks like 10 long container size aquaponic units that are going to be attached to high schools in St. Louis to teach people about how this works, about what it would be like to work in a factory like this. I don't know what all the benefits are, but I know that they're paying $16 an hour plus benefits, plus health care, et cetera, in this particular operation. And it's going to be seeking people from the region, so it's going to be certainly poor and probably a lot of African Americans. It's going to have a lot of people who were probably formerly incarcerated, and this particular employee has made a point of hiring people like that in the past. We have been trying to get them to do an ESOP or an employee stock option, kind of where employees could have an ownership position in the company. It's just really hard with tax laws. So what he's given us is a challenge, and I open this challenge up to you because it's not an NGO's job to go and raise $5 to $10 million, which is what we're talking about here. He's got about 70 million of investment that he needs. If 5 or 10 million of that could not be from equity, but could be a debt investment with an interest rate that could be paid off, he would vest that as a profit sharing plan with all the workers in the plant in perpetuity. And so those are the kind of things that could happen here that could be interesting, because he says, first of all, people who've not been employed, people who've been in jail, they don't really care about a 10 or 20 year down the road retirement plan. They care about what's in the paycheck at the end of the month. And so profit sharing on a monthly basis could be a real incentive for some people.
Jason, I might tell you that Chris Dalbert, the Dean of Agriculture here, and I actually were in St. Louis talking to the very people doing the vertical ag stuff a couple months ago. They have expressed interest, and our colleagues at the University of Missouri St. Louis are tied into it, potentially doing this center that you're talking about on their campus. So this thing is all spinning in a very interesting way. So I share that because there's a whole lot of synergy around this right now in that region.
And St. Louis, just by chance, has more ag under glass than any other city in the U.S. because of Bayer and Danforth and the Missouri Botanical Gardens. So there's a lot of synergies here.
Yeah, a lot of them. We're going to have 2 last questions. I'm going to go to the audience.
Schnucks actually has put a contract
Schnucks.
for an offtake agreement with part of this, and is also putting 3 of these containers with stores of theirs so the customers can see how it works.
Charlie, I'm going to go to you with a quick question. You talked about science says what we should do, society tells us what we can do.
The way around.
Well, tell me, walk me through that.
Yeah. So science tells us whether or not we can do something. Society will tell us whether or not we should.
Walk me through that.
So we've operated under an assumption that if we have good science, if we have good data, if we have good facts, that should be sufficient for people to accept what we do. And that's great, but social acceptance is a multidimensional, complex process that's based on more than just information. How do I feel? What kind of information am I gathering? What are my friends and neighbors saying? What's my past experience been? We actually did a lot of consumer work over the last year using a model from Sechrist and Hart from the EU on consumer acceptance of ag technology. And it ends up being very predictive. Some of the R-squares are between 0.72 and 0.84, which for social science is pretty high. But there's a whole range of social factors that influence acceptance. Is it familiar? Is it going to address something that's relevant to me? Is there a disgust factor? There's a whole range of different things that we have to take into account. The point being really for agriculture is to understand that we can have the best science in the world, we can have all the data, we can have all the facts, but it's not sufficient. It's essential. You can't start the conversation if you don't have that, but it's not sufficient to drive acceptance. So acceptance is a social process, not a scientific process.
Great statement.
I just wanted to mention one other thing that I think might be of interest to this particular group. So I remember 15 years ago reading an issue of the Missouri Conservationists talking about how much income was being made growing mushrooms in the Ozarks, and it just blew me away, the per acre income and how it was significant for a number of producers. When we started the work in St. Louis, I had in the back of my mind that there are all these caves in St. Louis, I think 93 in the city of St. Louis itself. Why don't we grow mushrooms? So I reached out to Costco and to their mushroom provider, who is based in Canada of all places, but there is quite an interest there, not in portobellos or white mushrooms, but in the specialty mushrooms. So maitake, probably oyster mushrooms of various kinds, all different kinds of mushrooms. Well, that would be a very high income kind of generation type of project too. And that is labor intensive and could be quite useful, and use barges to get it out in the Intercoastal Canal into other places.
All right, I know we've got some questions here. I'm going to go to Rob and to Mel Wilberson. I think you're over on this side. Rob, I'll let you start out.
If anybody has any questions, feel free to come down and ask your question. You're more than encouraged to. And while you make up your mind, I have a question from online. It says, please help us understand how plant-based meat protein is better for me, better for the planet, especially when compared to fully grass-fed and grass-finished beef, and where soils are too poor for growing row crops, but good enough for grass?
Good question. So I don't have any evidence that it is, but that's a perception, right? And the desire for better for me, better for the planet products is what drove that extreme initial sampling. So the point I was trying to make was, pay attention to what drove that sampling. It was the perception of better for me, better for the planet, and the real desire for better for me, better for the planet products. So that's the opportunity for grass-fed producers or other producers to lean into that and to have the conversation about, we really want to make sure that what we're producing is better for you and better for the planet. Let's have the conversation, and let me share with you why we believe our products meet that demand. So the point I was trying to make was that initial sampling is a signal there's an opportunity, and it's an opportunity we should pay attention to.
So just to follow up with that, it's not about either or, it's more so about that aligned vision towards better for me, better for the planet, and making sure you differentiate in that way.
Yeah, I think again, it's about how do you have that conversation, and people say, well, wait a minute, because I've heard all of these things about beef production, and it's this and it's that and the other thing. So what are you actually doing to address that? And I'm concerned about cholesterol, or I'm concerned about, so you have to be able to have that conversation. Yes, you have a single ingredient. Yes, you have micronutrients and macronutrients that can be very helpful in the diet, but we need to embrace the concerns and address them and not be defensive about it.
And feel free to go to either mic.
Hi there, Annette Kendall with Extension Business and Innovation. Last week I spoke to a small food manufacturer, and his quote directly was that trying to sell innovation in food in Missouri is impossible because we just won't buy anything that's out there. And so he was finding more success on the coasts than in Missouri. So I'm interested in your comments around this and whether you agree or not, and then strategies for small food producers like this guy.
I'll take a stab. I see we're getting the number 3. We've got 3 minutes. Okay, so we'll have to make this pretty quickly. So I think there's the opportunity for innovation in every market. Every market is different, and I think it's important to understand what are the market demands in that particular area. And so without knowing what he's trying to sell and more information about the details, I can't comment on it specifically, but I can say that market dynamics are geographically and culturally specific. And so you've got to make sure that you're appealing to the market that you're trying to sell to, or it's going to be an uphill battle.
But I do think there's an opportunity right now with increased growing seasons in Missouri. In different parts of Missouri, it's different. But also people, as the corn-soy rotation wanes because of, at least on the corn side, increasing temperatures, et cetera, I think there's an opportunity to begin to spread out and grow multiple crops in a way that was quite common 40 or 50 years ago that just went away. And then with that diversity, you can begin to enter in other types of farming as well. I remember talking to a farmer in Nebraska not very long ago, a young guy, and he's growing birdseed, he's growing sunflowers, he's growing different pulses on a conventional row crop farm. And it just struck me as something very smart to do.
Got another question? Got one more down here. We'll take this one.
I probably should have written it down, so I'll try to articulate this. It's more of a curiosity. So early in the conversation about climate change, you mentioned that we're marching closer to living on not the interest, but the principle of the world, right? And then we talked about how the permafrost is melting and more crops are moving into the permafrost, which is contributing to those gases. And I thought, and you may have kind of inferred as you were going along, that would it not equalize? Are we losing some of those crops that are closer to the equator as we're adding more? But it sounds like instead we're adding more because we're adjusting and we're evolving and we're changing in these areas that can no longer grow those crops that we're used to. So if in fact that's the truth, it's not like we're going to lose those areas for crop growth, right? We're just sort of adding to it, and we're kind of inching up closer to those poles, and that's why those gases would be increasing. Does that make sense? It's just a clarification, and
Right,
it's
sure.
coming from a place of just not knowing.
Right, yeah. So basically this, I think it was a month or two ago, on the planet we reached what's called peak land for food. And what that means is that we are not increasing the amount of land we use every year to produce food. That's the first time that's happened in anybody's record. Since we invented domestication, it has always been increasing. Now, we're doing that, and we're still deforesting, and we're still converting grasslands because we're throwing away a lot of land out the back end that's been degraded and we can't use it anymore. And so we need to really freeze that. One of the things I didn't mention is that we have got to reduce the emissions associated with the food we eat, not just relatively, but absolutely, by 60 to 80%. And nobody is thinking about that right now. And so the farming in Siberia is going to release even more gases. Farming in Brazil, where you deforest, releases even more gases. Farming the northern Great Plains, where you plow up grasslands, releases more gases. So how are we going to get to a 60 to 80% reduction? That's where I think we start actively reforesting. We start actively allowing degraded land to go back, but even encourage it to go back and encourage it to become a different kind of productive asset with natural resources, et cetera.